Grüß, willkommen in einem meiner Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 64 of my game System Design series. In this video, I'll be discussing the ergonomics of a card-based ad hoc scenario generation system. A number of years ago, one of my comrades suggested I consider creating a card-based scenario generation system, and I have to admit, while I'm rather surprised, I have not looked back. Initially skeptical, as I'm not a real fan of card-based systems of any description, I converted my previous less than successful table and dice-based scenario generation system into a card format, and with a few tweaks, it's proved highly successful. In simple terms, each card represents a part of a player's force mix, with a points value based on when it enters the game. Players randomly select cards until they have created an initial force mix, that's total force mix, and reinforcement schedule based on a points limit. You can do it randomly, or what I do these days is I simply give each player all the cards and they simply build their force mix and reinforcement schedule accordingly, whatever players particularly prefer. So just to give you an example, if this division enters the game on game turn 1, it has a value of 11 points. If, on the other hand, this division enters the game on game turn 7, which is the halfway point of the game, it has a value of 6 points. The other two values are for entry on game turn 4 and 10, assuming the game is a 12 game turn game. I previously built a system similar to this into a table, which did not really work. I mean, it worked, but it was not particularly very joyful or enjoyable, and we tended to skip it. Spinning a die roll to determine your force mix was simply boring, and players felt they had no real control. So in the end, I rarely ever used that system. Selecting cards from a deck, while random or not random, makes the players feel that they have more control, even if the result could be potentially identical. This makes no logical sense, but it is an example of a game system which aligns with the way humans operate, and it takes a real art to select the correct game system, or at least it takes a lot of playtesting to arrive at such a game system which really resonates. My comrades also wanted me to add other scenario-related cards such as flank attack, hidden units, fortifications, and all the typical special rules associated with a typical historical scenario. This was never part of any of my scenario generation systems, card-based, dice or table or whatever, but nonetheless, after buying into the idea, I went overboard with too many cards because I actually loved the system, but finally did have to wind back a bit, and I arrived at an optimal sized card deck with random or special events which mimicked a historical scenario in an ad hoc scenario system. It should be noted, any card system is period and rules agnostic. However, it should be noted any card system needs to be customized to the period and in some cases to the rules as well. A set of cards for ancients is very different to that of World War II scenario. Napoleonics, World War II and Cold War tends to be reasonably similar, but even in these cases some differences do exist between the periods. In this particular video, I'll be mainly focusing on World War II using a battalion element scale set of rules. I do intend to create a card deck for a number of other rules, such as LWRS, Spearhead, and possibly even Corps Commander. The considerations for this will be discussed later in the video, as changing the element scale requires more tweaking to any particular card system that you happen to develop. Let's now discuss some of the ergonomic considerations any designers need to consider when implementing a card-based scenario generation system. The first ergonomic consideration is the number of cards each player randomly selects. In all my systems, each player has 9 force mix cards. Each force mix card represents part of the player's total force mix. I initially selected 9 for no good reason and never had any issues with this, so I never changed it. So I have to assume this represents some form of optimal number which I accidentally picked. I'm considering 12 cards as an option, but then you come to a critical issue. Increasing the number of cards requires increasing the size of the game, and you need to ask yourself how large a game do you wish. And in the end, after experimenting with this a little bit, I didn't actually see much benefit. So 9 force mix cards is pretty much the maximum. In some cases, you could even reduce that down to 6. Saying that, I do suspect the optimal number of force mix cards is probably linked to the size of a typical game. I've generally found an average of 48 elements per side over the entire length of the game, that is average of 48 elements over the entire length of the game, is optimal. Any more in the game takes far too long to play, although less can be viable, although don't get too few. Because players can select cards to arrive later as reinforcements, a typical game requires about 60 elements per side. That is, each player should have more than 48 elements to select from. Not all of the elements are used for the entire length of the game, and if you bring in reinforcements, you need more elements to compensate for the fact that they come in later in the game. As this is a rather important concept, let's just drill down to it in a little bit more detail. If a game lasts 12 game turns and you fill 48 elements for the entire game, the average number of elements available per game turn is 48. If, on the other hand, you field 24 elements for the entire game and you have 48 elements arrive at the halfway point, the average number of elements per game turn still remains 48. Yet in this case, the player could be fielding 72 elements for the second half of the game. You need those elements if you're going to go down this particular path. Using this system, if you want to push it to its edge, it's possible to field a total of 152 elements in the last 3 game turns. I have, from bitter experience, discovered that being outnumbered by 4 to 1 for 9 game turns in order to outnumber my opponent for by just over 3 to 1 for 3 game turns is not a winning strategy. So this is a fringe case which will almost certainly result in a loss in most cases, but is, I suppose, technically possible. So in conclusion, in most cases a player will field a minimum of 48 elements and a maximum of 72 elements, with the average number sitting somewhere in between, probably around about 60. That's what players really need to have to use this ad hoc scenario generation system. Whatever the mix, this average of 48 elements over the entire game gives you a game which you'll certainly complete within a day, no matter how slow you may play a game, and with the possibility of a second game within a day. I generally find that with this particular size, if you're very experienced and the rules are simple, you can get through a game in 2 to 3 hours, and that allows you to have up to 3 games in a day. That is a long day, but more reasonably, you can certainly get 2 games in a day, which is a good objective to have. Let's go into a little bit more detail. If you field 48 elements, how would you break them up into individual cards? I must be honest, and I simply copied the DBM core system and decided each card should consist of 12 elements, which is the DBM building block. In World War II terms, this is more complex, but using a battalion element scale, a typical division consists of 12 frontline elements and 3 to 4 artillery elements. So it does align, sort of. In this example, the division consists of 9 infantry battalions and 3 supporting battalions. In these rules, there are support formations, which represent the regimental support formations. So 3 additional elements are added, or their strength could be incorporated into the standard infantry battalions. Using no particular science and based more on gut feel, I feel my 48 elements should be broken up into 12 element cards. So a player would use 4 cards if there was no reinforcements, and 6 cards if a typical reinforcement schedule is used. In this case, if your force mix cards total 9 cards, you get a reasonable level of variety, while ensuring the minimum number of cards are present. If you increase the cards to 12, it's difficult to determine if there's any real benefit. So I selected 9 force mix cards as an optimal number, and it seems to work reasonably well using this methodology. If your force mix is going to be larger, you could increase the number of cards or increase the number of elements on a card. So for example, if you want to have a force mix which is double the size, thus a game will probably last for 8 hours, then maybe it's quite viable to have a minimum of 12 cards per side. A more difficult issue was the special events cards, such as flank attack, hidden units, and so on. It took me several playtest sessions, but I quickly discovered the number of special effects cards should be the same as the force mix cards, which means 9 special cards that you select from is optimal. If you have too many special effects cards, the player could end up with no force mix cards if you select the force mix cards randomly, and far too many special effects cards. If the number of special effects cards were reduced, then it could be possible to have few, if any, special effects cards before you complete your force mix and reinforcement schedule determination. So if you're going to randomly select your force mixes, you do need a certain minimum size. When the number of each cards are about the same, 9 on each side, if a player selects 5 force mix cards, that player will probably end up with 5 special effects cards as well, on average. In my original card system, I provided 27 special effects cards, which really failed to work. The other issue I had was several special effects were just too similar, so players needed to choose which to use. I concluded 9 special effects cards were optimal for the random selection, and to allow for more special effects than 9, I group all 27 cards into one of 9 special effects card groups. A player would only select one card from each group into their random deck, providing that player with a deck of 9 cards, because there are 9 special effects groups. This, in effect, represents the player's operational plan. Depending on the card selection, the player could conduct this plan, or would have to make last-minute modifications. A player could select a number of defensive cards, but then discover he needs to be the attacker. This is an extreme example, but attempts to duplicate the confusion and real-life conditions or situations of actual conflict in a manageable manner. I have to admit, some of the groups, special effects groups, only contain one card, and if all you had was 9 special effects, then no specific selection process would be required. It really depends how many in total special effects cards you want to use. There are also special force mix cards, such as air support cards. Players could play none, some, or all eligible air support cards in their deck. Only one card really would be used in the deck, with the others being disposed of, and there will be some historical limitation of which card you can actually put in your random deck based on the scenario that you're doing. While air power is useful, air power cannot hold objectives, so some players may select a lesser option, or no air power, depending on their circumstances. The other wild card is weather could affect their usefulness, so in winter few players would select air power card, as that would use up valuable points for minimal benefit. Other cards you could throw into the player's deck are weather cards, which could affect a single game turn. The game turn would be randomly selected and diced for at the beginning of each game turn. The weather event would depend on the season and climatic region. One rather important factor to consider is card design. I attempted many different formats, but finally selected on a simple font and using a simple structure with only critical and useful information contained on the card. As these cards will be used as a form of cheat sheet by players, they should certainly contain the element's combat values. They need to be quite readable in this case, clear and easy to reference data from. One issue I had was the point system. Originally the cards contained the full points value of all the elements, so the German Panzer Division had a value of 85 points. However, I discovered it was easier to calculate your force mix and reinforcement schedule if the values were smaller, so I divided everything by 4. While the German Panzer Division is rather large, the value of 21 is easier to keep in your head when moving your cards around to determine when this force should enter. This is a rather trivial point, but I found it makes the job of building your force mix and reinforcement schedule much easier and, more importantly, quicker. On average, I found each card should have an average of 12 points. That way you can hit your 48 pretty easily. So drilling into more detail, in this case using a limit of 48 points, the British player has created a force mix and reinforcement schedule totalling 50 points, which exceeds the limit by 2 and results in a -2 VP for the British player. If we're dealing with a points limit of 192 points, we would need a pen and paper to calculate the force mix and reinforcement schedules. This took me several games to realise, and while the rounding can be slightly problematic, it works and works reasonably well. In this example, the elements represent battalions. If the elements represent companies, such as in LWRS or Panzer Corps, then each card would represent a regiment or brigade size formation. The divisional assets would be distributed among the regiment brigade size formation, resulting in 3 cards per division on average. As you'll be selecting from 4 to 5 cards in most cases, this represents 2 small divisions or a powerful division with core assets attached. If the elements were platoons, such as in Spearhead or Corps Commander, each card would represent a battalion. This is reasonably clean as battalions generally stay together, so all you need to do is add the regimental and divisional assets to each battalion, resulting in a final force mix from or of 3 to 6 battalions. Finally, if each element was a squad, such as in WRG rules, each card would represent a company with the player commanding a battalion-sized formation. The advantage of using cards is there's no need to worry about using a points-based army list to carefully craft your force mix. You select a card which represents a historical formation and simply arrange them as you desire. Moving beyond the actual cards, we now need to consider the entire force mix card deck and how this affects play and play balance. This shows a set of 9 force mix cards, in this case for the Axis player in North Africa between August and December 1942. This is based on the forces available to the Axis at this point in time. This represents the US force mix for the same campaign. You will notice 2 cards are dummy cards. In this case, the US did not have 9 formations, divisional size formations, although some of the divisions could be, I suppose, split up. Dummy cards are no real issue, as long as the US player has 9 force mix cards to select from, or if it's not randomly selected, as long as they can build up their 48 to 60 point force mix and reinforcement schedule with the cards they have on hand. There is one issue with unbalanced force mixes, as this is based on historical force mixes and as a result is not abstract. The force mixes will probably end up being comparatively unbalanced between the two sides. Minor adjustments can be made by removing battalions or adding corps or army support battalions, but this can only go so far. In this case, the US card total is 101 points and averages 11 points per card. The Axis total is 77 points with an average of 9 points per card. I'm uncertain if this causes any issue, but to guard against this I normally provide a force mix guideline which is 4 times the average points limit. Thus a game could range from 36 points if you're using the Axis forces as your guide, or 44 points if you're using the US cards. Players would select one of the 2 options, or could just use the default 48 points. I have not conducted sufficient playtesting to determine how this affects the game, but so far it's not causing me any obvious play balance issues. The only thing that I notice is the American player in this case has less cards to select, so they're limited in how they build their forces, while the Axis have more cards to select and they have more flexibility in sort of customizing their reinforcement and force mix schedule. However, this does not seem to impact play balance, at least at the present moment. I should also point out in my playtesting this difference in the player card sets do force players to adopt different strategies, with lesser but more powerful divisions providing different advantages and disadvantages when compared with more but weaker divisions. Let's now relook at the special events cards in more detail. It's very possible you do not have any special events card. That was my original strategy, but I was convinced to add special events cards, and I feel they do add something in terms of creating a unique game which resembles a historical scenario. This concept is certainly not new, and DBMM uses something similar with their stratagems. The stratagems do affect play balance, and this is mitigated by the expenditure of points in order to use the cards. I originally went with the point strategy, but now I've changed my mind and now use a VP strategy. The VP strategy adds or subtracts VPs based on the special effects cards used. Thus, a hidden unit card would subtract 3 VPs if a player plays that card. Using a VP strategy for special cards, or when you do so, you end up with something that is closer to a historical scenario. The game itself may not be even, but this is compensated for by the victory conditions. I personally prefer this strategy as you end up with a more dynamic game. Some special effect cards may not require a VP impact, as it may result in both an advantage or disadvantage, so it gets negated, so to speak. This is the second version of this video, and what I'm showing now is the new version of cards that I've made, which have tweaked the old cards quite a bit. For World War II and Cold War, I now allow each player to select their force mixes from the entire 9 force mix card deck, which I've mentioned earlier, rather than randomly selecting them. The only randomly selected cards are the special events cards, in which case each player selects 4, well, based on the commander. In some cases it could be 3, it could be 4, it could be 5, and that is the random effect. Players can still use the original system where everything gets selected randomly, but for World War II and Cold War I found this gives you a more realistic force mix. This is because for World War II each player normally gets 3 mobile cards, 3 foot cards and 3 attached cards. It's possible to randomly select a totally dysfunctional force mix, and I've done this many times in the past. For Napoleonic games, I retain the random selection process because there is no downside using a random selection process, and I actually think it does add a little bit of pizzazz to any game. However, in conclusion, using a card-based scenario generating system offers significant benefits. Because players are selecting and organising cards, they are involved and feel they are in control of their gaming fate. The cards, if designed correctly, contain all the rules necessary to use them. This means there's no need to reference the actual rules book when a player encounters a card never used before. No pre-game study is required, basically. The players can simply read the card and gains all the information required to use the card. I must point out, this video is primarily focused on players creating their own cards in order to generate scenarios. Making cards can be simple if you possess a dot matrix printer, some 200 to 300 GSM paper, and some clear stick-on contact to cover the cards. Print a single A4 sheet with the front of the cards, then reverse the sheet and print the rear. The paper will need to be thick. Standard 80 GSM will create a rather flimsy card. The sides may be also offset, but as all your cutting will be focused on the front of the cards, having the flags slightly offset at the rear should not really be a major issue. Then cover one side of the sheet with clear plastic contact. Cut the clear plastic contact which overlaps and then flip the sheet. Cover the other side with clear contact and then cut the cards out. Important, make sure all your cutting is done on the card contact side. The sheet will be offset, and having the flags offset is better than missing critical information on the other side. Basically, make sure you do the initial cut on the front of the card where the information is held. There are many ways of creating cards which are more professional as a result, but this gives you cards reasonably easily, or allows you to create them reasonably easily and quickly, and you don't need to worry about gluing things or getting any kind of professional equipment in order to do so. And so we come to a conclusion of episode 64 of my video on game system design, in this case looking at the ergonomics of a card-based system. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.